Okay, so Harold and I, we have been working on CBDC and monetary policy for quite a while now, I think, with different co-authors, and you just saw one of our projects all over, I think. So in my opinion, the case is not really clear-cut whether CBDC has things to offer that we cannot accomplish right now. But I think there's one dimension that is interesting to CBDC that looks at a scenario where you take as given the rise of a large CBDC by a foreign country. Yeah, and so Pierpaolo, Harold, and I, we have a paper, so we started working on that 2019, about what happens if you introduce a global currency to a two-country setting, where these two countries start off with having their national currencies and their national bonds. And then you introduce a global currency on top of that. And you can think of this global currency as a CBDC, a US-based CBDC maybe, So a US CBDC, for whatever reason it is introduced, I think will be a hit. It's the most stable US stablecoin that could ever be out there. And I think has certainly the potential to become widely adopted also beyond the United States if this is admissible. And if you start off with that scenario, taking as given the introduction of a CBDC that is used for transaction purposes in different countries, then you get quite interesting monetary policy implications, but potentially in a very disruptive way. So what we are looking at is or results that are well known in the literature is if you start off with a one country setting, national currency is used, then traditionally national currencies do not compete across countries. It's not the case that you can use the euro in the United States and vice versa. It's simply not accepted and there's nothing that you can do about it. And what about bonds? Well, I, as an investor in Europe, I can invest in US bonds, but how do I do that? I'm exposed to exchange rate risk because I need to exchange my euros to US dollars, invest in US dollars, stay invested, and then exchange back. And so an expectation, there's a relationship that has to hold across time, taking into account exchange rates. So there's no direct competition between bonds that would be free of exchange rate, and there's no direct competition between national currencies. It's just not feasible. But if you introduce a global currency on top of that, and again, this could be a global CBDC, then things change. So if you are an economist or you have a background in finance, you might have heard about the impossible trinity. So in international finance, this just means if you have free cash flows, if you're free to invest, and you have a fluctuating exchange rate that's subject to market conditions, it is the case that central banks are free in choosing their monetary policy. And so it turns out that if you introduce a global currency, this is not necessarily longer the case. It's rather that if central banks do not take care, do not watch each other with regard to how they set monetary policy, they risk crowding out their national currencies. Okay, and so this is an implication of monetary policy caused by a foreign CBDC that is certainly disruptive. And I want to give you a little bit of an insight where this result comes from. So you can think of it as, so famous result by Carrick and Wallace is simply if you have one country and you have two competing currencies, then across time the exchange rate has to be constant, simply by no arbitrage conditions. And if you introduce stochasticity, then there's a paper by Anu and Pelipek that essentially says that same results holds an expectation exchange rates have to be constant, because no arbitrage competes these things away. Now, but again, we are in a two-country setting, so why should there be direct competition between national currencies? This is not the case per se, but what happens is if you have a global currency that you introduce in the same global currency that is used in both countries, then you're creating in each country direct currency competition, and through the global currency as a transmitter, in fact, you're creating competition between these national currencies. So global currencies act as a transmitter and cause direct national currency competition. Yeah, and so this has implications for central banks to set their interest rates on bonds, because liquidity services on currency, they have to stand in a particular relationship to nominal interest rates. Okay, and so via no arbitrage, central banks are no longer free in setting their nominal interest rates. Okay, so another issue that I wanted to touch on is the introduction of a CBDC with regard to government spending. So we know that in times of crisis, we observe flight to safety by very large market participants, money market mutual funds, pension funds, and so on. So they're drawing their cash out of the market. Very often, in fact, simultaneously out of stock markets and, in fact, cryptocurrency markets right now. This is why we see the strong co-movement between stocks and crypto. Typically, then, there's a shift into government bonds. Yeah, because they are safe government bonds. Yeah. And now, but what happens if you introduce a CBDC and you allow international investors? If the CBDC is perceived as safer as certain government bonds, you're creating a shortage of funding for governments. And so how is this related to monetary policy? Well, we have just observed the ECB had an emergency meeting about nominal interest rates on Italian bonds, and apparently now synchronization of bond yields is an issue of central banks, and or has become an issue of central banks, and so this is something to take into account, yeah, when introducing a CBDC. Okay, thank you.